Oh, no. No, no, no. The man turned from the overhead bin and looked at Delia the way you'd look at a wet dog that had wandered onto your kitchen table. I'm sorry I'm not doing this. I'm not sitting next to Times, that Times for 7 hours. Look at it. Cressida. Look at the shoes. Look at is that Times dirt Times under her fingernails? Did they let a gravedigger into first class? Or is this the new airline policy where they just scoop up whatever they find at the bus terminal and hand it a boarding pass? Because I paid $1,400 for this seat, and I am not spending the flight next to something that appears to have crawled directly out of the ground. You didn't pay for it. Marcus, your company did. The woman beside him in 4B set down her champagne glass with the specific precision of a woman who had never once raised her voice and did not need to. And don't embarrass yourself. It's not a gravedigger. It's worse. Look at the bag. Marcus. That's field equipment. She's one of those university people they let roam around in the dirt and then give a salary to. She tilted her head toward Delia with the air of a woman consulting a wine list and finding the vintage insulting. You're an academic, aren't you? Some sort of, what is it? Bones. You dig up bones and write papers about them that no one reads? And the university gives you a travel budget so you can fly in from wherever the bones are and contaminate first-class cabins with your findings. Am I close? You're close enough, Delia said. Seat 4A. Excuse me. She did not say it loudly. She was not a woman who said things loudly. She stepped past them, put the gray field bag in the overhead, sat down in 4A, and took out the thing she always took out on airplanes, the small, flat evidence envelope she kept in her chest pocket, the one with the sealed fragment inside, the one she touched when she needed to remember what any of this was for. She held it in her lap. She looked out the window at the dark Atlanta tarmac. In 5 hours and 40 minutes, over the dark of the Gulf, a man in this cabin was going to stop breathing. And Marcus Hale and Cressida Hale and the whole first-class cabin of a flight that had just decided, by its comfortable silence, that a woman with dirt under her fingernails did not belong in its orbit. All of them were going to have their continued existence on this earth determined by whether that woman, in the middle of that silence, had been telling the truth about what she did for a living. She had been telling the truth. She always had been. But we're getting ahead of things. To understand what happened at 34,000 feet over the Gulf of Mexico that night, why a man who had been dead for nearly 4 minutes came back, why a cabin that had reduced a woman to a punchline was sitting in the dark, listening for her voice, you have to go back. Not 5 hours, 32 years. You have to go back to a girl named Delia, 12 years old, standing in an empty lot in southwest Atlanta, where they were building a new road, watching a backhoe turn up something pale and curved in the red Georgia dirt, and feeling, for the first time in her life, the specific chill of understanding that the earth was full of people, that the ground held them, that every place you stood had been stood on by someone before. Her name is Dr. Adaiz Delia Emeka. She is 44 years old. And on the night this story happens. She is a forensic anthropologist, one of those people who does not exist, as far as most of the world is concerned, until the day they are needed, who do the specific and terrible and necessary work of reading what a body says when it can no longer speak for itself, of taking bones from the ground and telling the dead, on by on, who they were, how they lived, how they came to be where they were found. Hold on to that. The reading of what is left. It is going to be the whole of the story. But at 9 at night, none of them knew that. All they saw were the shoes. Let me tell you about the shoes. Because Marcus Hale spent a good 30 seconds on them, and it is worth knowing what he was actually curling his lip at. They were leather. Brown. Good leather. But the kind of good leather that had been repaired twice at a cobbler's. Resoled. Restitched at the toe, the shoes of a woman who bought one good pair and wore it into the earth and got it pulled back out again. There was red Georgia clay in the creases of the sole. She'd come from a site that morning. The Forsyth County case. The cold one that had been cold for 31 years until 2 weeks ago when a construction crew pulled up the foundation of an old barn and found what was underneath it. She had been in the ground at 6 a.m. with a brush and a grid and a set of calipers. And she had flown from Atlanta to Dallas on a connection because the nonstop was full. And she had not changed her shoes, because changing her shoes had not been the point. The bag was worse, by Marcus's standards. Canvas. Olive. One of the straps replaced with webbing. A stenciled number on the side from a university equipment room. Inside it, a battered paperback and a headlamp and a half-eaten granola bar. Because she forgot to eat on site days. And a clear plastic box of dental picks and brushes nested in foam. And in the zipper pocket on the front, the thing she always traveled with, an evidence envelope. Sealed, the size of a playing card. With a small fragment of bone inside it. Not evidence in the case. Something else. We'll get to that. The girl asleep against Delia's shoulder. Before Delia had even reached her row, the one who had gotten on first, who had curled into the window seat like she'd been traveling her whole life, was not Delia's daughter. Her name was Imani, and she was 14. And she was the daughter of a woman named Precious Osei, who had called Delia 6 weeks ago from a lawyer's office in Accra because Delia was the only person she knew who understood both sides of the equation, the legal side and the ground side, and what it meant when both sides met. Precious's mother had been a young woman in Ghana in 1989 who had gotten on a plane to America to study, and who had landed, and who had then disappeared, completely, from every record and from her family's life. 34 years. A family had spent 34 years not knowing. And 2 weeks ago, a volunteer search team working a cold case in a county outside Atlanta had found, in a culvert behind an old motel, remains that the GBI had matched, on DNA, to a family in Accra. Precious's mother, Imani's grandmother, a woman named Akua who had been 23 years old and had been carrying, when she died, a letter she had been writing home. Delia had worked the identification, had pulled Akua from the ground herself, had stood in a lab and spoken, in the only language available, for a woman who had been silent for 34 years. And when Precious had called and said she could not get a visa in time, that she could not come to Atlanta for the final proceedings, that there was no one, Delia had said, "I will bring Imani. She's family's closest living relative in the country. She should be there. I will bring her home, and I will sit beside her, and she will not be alone for any of it." That was why they were on the flight. Imani was going home to Accra. Delia was taking her. And in Delia's chest pocket, in the evidence envelope, was something that was not evidence. It was a piece of fabric, a small piece, cut from the letter. Akua had been carrying the one she'd been writing home preserved. Sent to Delia by the GBI lab with the note, "For the family, if appropriate." She had meant to give it to Imani. Had not yet found the right moment. She was going to find it on this flight. Or she was going to find it after what happened at 34,000 feet. One or the other. This is the story of Dr. Adaeze Emeka and of Flight 204. and of what a woman who has spent 20 years reading what the dead leave behind can do when a living man's body suddenly goes quiet. Here is what Marcus Hale did not know, checking his own reflection in the darkened window of 4C. And here is what Cressida did not know beside him. And here is what the senior flight attendant, Paul Griffith, 56, 30 years in the air, tired in the deepest possible way. The man who had drifted toward Delia with folded hands and the word times, perhaps times already forming, did not know that Delia had grown up in southwest Atlanta with a mother who cleaned offices at night and a father who drove a bus, and that she had been, from the age of 12, the kind of child who noticed what the ground held. She had walked past that construction site every day on the way to school for a week before the backhoe turned anything up. And she had known, without knowing how she knew, that the lot was not empty. She had gone to the library the next day and found the archaeology section and taken out every book it had. And she had read them in a week. And she had gone back for more. She had studied at Spelman, then at Michigan, then the 2-year fellowship in Lyon that had been the best and loneliest time of her life. She had worked genocide cases in Rwanda and mass grave sites in Bosnia and cold cases in 12 American states. She had stood in more places than she could count with her hands in the earth and done the specific work of naming the unnamed, the woman in the culvert, the man in the field, the child under the barn floor, and had carried them back, on by on, into the daylight, into the record, into the specific dignity of being known. She had testified in 17 murder trials. The defense attorneys in 6 of them had tried to rattle her on the stand, had questioned her methods, her credentials, the subjectivity of her interpretations, and she had sat in the witness box and answered every question in the same even voice. She used to answer questions at the site, the voice that came from knowing exactly what she knew and exactly what she didn't, and from understanding that certainty was not the point. The point was the reading. The point was sitting with the evidence long enough to hear what it said. Her name was known in the field. The defense attorneys who'd tried to rattle her had found out why. The families of the identified had her number in their phones. She was in 4A, with red clay in the creases of her shoes, and a child asleep against her, and a piece of fabric in her pocket for the right moment. And she had not changed her shoes, because changing her shoes had not been the point. Paul Griffith came to her row. He said, in the careful voice of a man who had been doing this for 30 years, Dr. Emeka, I wonder if I might find you and the young lady something. There may be some availability further back in the cabin. If... Delia looked at him, not unkindly. She said, Paul, is that your name? Paul. I'm in 4A. The young lady is in 4B. She did not raise her voice. Did not point out that 4B was now Marcus Hale's seat, which he had taken specifically to put himself between Delia and the aisle. I sat her in the window seat because she gets airsick. I need to be able to see her. So we'll be staying here. She paused. If there's a complaint, I'm happy to speak with whoever needs to hear from me directly. Is there a complaint? Paul looked at Marcus. Marcus was doing something involved with his phone, no longer looking at either of them. The complaint, apparently, was not a complaint that Marcus wanted to formalize. Paul looked back at Delia and found, in her expression, nothing that gave him anywhere to go. He said, Let me know if I can bring you anything. I'll let you know, she said. He moved on. From the row behind her, 5A, someone leaned forward, a woman's voice. Varm. Southern. In the direct, unfussy register of someone who had watched enough of other people's nonsense to stop pretending she had not seen it. That was well handled. Delia turned. The woman was in her late 60s, white-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a legal pad on the tray table covered in handwriting. Her name was Dr. Frances Albright, and she was a retired federal judge. And she had been on the morning's flight from Atlanta to Dallas and had missed her connection and had been rerouted. And she had the specific, alert, unhurried quality of a woman who had spent 40 years reading people across a courtroom. "I've seen it handled worse," Delia said. "I've presided over it," Frances said, and sentenced a few of the handlers. "I'm Frances." Delia. "Forensic anthropology," Frances said. "I saw the bag. Are you coming from the Forsyth case? I followed the coverage." Delia looked at her for a moment. "You know about the Forsyth case." "I sentenced the man who put her there," Frances said, quietly. 32 years ago. Different charge. He walked on the other thing because we couldn't find her. And then 2 weeks ago, they found her." She looked at Amani, still asleep. "Is this family?" "The granddaughter," Delia said, "going home." Frances was quiet for a moment. She looked at the piece of evidence envelope visible in Delia's chest pocket. She did not ask about it. She said, "Thank you for doing this work." "It's the work," Delia said, and that was enough for both of them. Across the aisle in 4C, not Marcus. Marcus was in 4B. Next to Cressida was a man named Derek Holt, 31, who worked in something involving venture-backed software startups, and who had been on his phone since boarding, with the phone held at a specific angle that indicated he was filming, not calling, and who had sent the clip Marcus and Cressida's performance, Delia's response, the whole thing to his 40,000 followers with the caption, "First class on a Wednesday, wild out." The clip was going to be seen by 2 million people in the next 18 hours, which was not something Derek knew yet. What was going to happen to Derek? In terms of his professional standing and his startup's Series A and his relationship with the investor who had specifically sent him this ticket, was not going to be pleasant. But Derek did not know that either. And in 5C, behind Derek, was a man named Samuel Boateng, 67, broad, with the careful hands of a man who had been a surgeon for 38 years and was now retired, and who had learned in 38 years of surgery that the two most important things in any room were the information you had and the information you did not know you were missing. Samuel had seen the boarding situation. Samuel had formed an opinion about it. Samuel had opened his novel and not said anything. Because Samuel had learned, also in 38 years of surgery, that the moment to speak was the moment that required speech. And this was not yet that moment. But Samuel Boateng was watching. And when the moment came, he was going to be the first person moving. The flight was 3 hours and midnight. The gulf below, invisible and black, when the flight attendant call from row 7 came. The man in 7B had been fine at dinner, had been fine at the drink service, had been, as far as his wife in 7A could tell, perfectly fine until he was not. Until the specific not fine, that is not an announcement, but a collapse, a man folding in on himself in a seat. A wife making the sound that wives make when a body stops cooperating. A sound that does not need to be translated in any language or any cabin. Delia was awake. She had been awake, reading, with Imani's head on her shoulder, for the last hour. She was awake. She heard the sound, and she was standing before the call button had been pressed. Samuel Boateng was also standing. They reached row 7 at the same time. The man, James Reardon, 61, a property developer from Houston. Traveling with his wife Elaine, was unresponsive, not asleep. Unresponsive in the specific way that Delia knew, from a context no one expected her to know it. She had been the first on scene at 2 separate mass casualty events in her career. And she had done field triage. And she had the specific knowledge of someone who had learned to read a body's stillness the way she read bones. The stillness of James Reardon was not sleep. She said, "To Samuel," in a voice quiet enough not to start the cabin. "Pulse?" Samuel had 2 fingers on the neck. Faint. "Rhythm's wrong." Delia said, "Paul." Paul Griffith was already moving. "Medical kit. Aid. Now." She was leaning over James, turning him, getting his airway. She was not a physician. She was a woman who had done field work in conditions without physicians for 20 years, who had an advanced wilderness first responder certification that she renewed every 2 years because the work took her to places where you were the only person available, and who had, specifically, done AED training 4 times and had used one twice, once in a Rwanda village in 2009 and once in a parking garage in Detroit in 2017. Both times with outcomes that she did not let herself think about as outcomes but as process. Because process was what you could control. She had the man's airway. She was maintaining it. Samuel said, "No pulse now. He's in arrest." She said, "Start compressions." And the cabin, which had been doing what cabins did in the dark and the quiet, reorganized itself around row 7, Paul arriving with the AED, which Delia took with one hand and started reading with the eyes of someone who had read it before. Imani awake now in 4A, with her eyes wide and her hands folded, and her young face doing the math. Francis Albright awake and standing in the aisle and staying exactly out of the way as she had learned to do in 40 years of allowing the competent to work. And Derek Holt's phone up, red light on, because Derek had not yet learned the thing you learned, which was that some moments were not content. Samuel was doing compressions. He had done this 10,000 times in 38 years of surgery, and his hands remembered. Delia had the AED pads on. She said, "Clear." Samuel lifted his hands. The machine read. It said what the machine said. She pressed the button. James Reardon's body lifted and settled. And then in the specific moment that does not have an adequate description, the one you felt in the sternum of every person in the row watching the rhythm came back. Not strong, not clean, but back, a heartbeat, faltering and real. Elaine Reardon made a sound. Delia said, "Stay back. Please." She did not say it unkindly. She was working. She worked for another 4 minutes with Samuel before she was confident enough in what she had to speak, at a level the rest of the cabin could hear. She said, "He's stable. He needs a hospital. We need to divert." She looked at Paul. "Who do I need to talk to?" Paul was already on the interphone to the flight deck. Marcus Hale, in 4B, had turned around to see what was happening. He had his hand over his mouth. His face, in the cabin dark, had the specific expression of a man watching something happen that he could not make a joke of, that would not submit to the register he used for everything, that required something from him that he did not know if he had. Cressida had not turned around. Cressida was looking at the back of the seat in front of her with perfect stillness. And you could not have said, from looking at her, whether she was frightened or processing or simply waiting for it to be over. The flight diverted to New Orleans. The ground team met them. James Reardon went onto the gurney with exactly the information they needed. Delia had been building the verbal handoff for the last 20 minutes of the descent. The timeline, the rhythm presentation, the shock count, the current status, and the paramedics took him efficiently and well in the gate area at Louis Armstrong. Waiting for the rebooked flight, Elaine Reardon found Delia. She said, They told me you're the one who." She stopped. She was 63 years old, and her husband was alive, and she did not have all the words. "They told me you're not a doctor." "No," Delia said. "I'm a forensic anthropologist. I identify human remains." Elaine looked at her. She was still processing the specific fact of what the night had been. She said, "You saved my husband's life." "Doctor, Boateng did the compressions." Delia said, "Paul brought the AED. Your husband's heart responded." She paused. "I just knew what the machine was for." "You knew because you've done it before," Elaine said. "I've done it before." Delia agreed. Elaine said, "Why do you do field triage? Why would a forensic anthropologist?" "Because I'm often the only person there," Delia said simply. "The work takes me to places where the nearest hospital is a long way away. You learn what you need to know for the situation you're actually in. I've been in situations where I was the person available. So I learned." She paused. "Your husband is going to be fine. He needs a procedure." The paramedic used the word catheterization, but he was in arrest for less than 4 minutes. And his rhythm came back clean after the first shock. His brain is not going to have been affected. He's going to wake up fine. Elaine sat down in a gate chair. She was shaking in the way people shook when the adrenaline drained. She said, "Thank you." "I'm glad I was there," Delia said. And she meant it the way you mean a thing when it is true and not a formality. She was glad she had been in 4A with red clay in the creases of her shoes. Glad she had been awake reading at midnight. Glad that a man in Houston had gotten on a plane in Atlanta and sat in row 7 on a night when she was on row 4. She was always glad. That was the thing about the work. The work of any kind. Forensic anthropology. Field triage. The sitting with of the dead and the keeping of the living. You were glad when you could. You carried the times you couldn't. And you kept going. Because the work did not stop. Marcus Hale found her in the gate area. She saw him coming and waited. She had spent 20 years dealing with men like Marcus in courtrooms, at university committees, at the specific kind of conference dinner where someone always thought it was interesting to explain forensic anthropology to the forensic anthropologist, and she had a settled relationship with it. He stood in front of her. He was 52 years old, and he had the specific expression of a man who had been loudly certain of something for a long time and had been shown, quietly and in public, that he was wrong, and who did not know the word for what he was feeling, because the word was humiliation, and he had not often been on the receiving end of it. He said, "I want to." He stopped. "What you did in there—" "Marcus," Delia said, not unkindly. The way she said everything. "I know what you want to say. You want to say that you didn't know? And that if you had known, you wouldn't have, and that may even be true. But I need you to hear the part that comes before that." She waited until he was listening. The actual listening. Not the performing of listening. You didn't know. That's the point. You decided what I was and what I deserved to be in 30 seconds before I'd said a word to you. Based on my shoes and the color of my hands and some idea you had of who belongs where. And the version of tonight where you knew about the board certifications and the court testimony and the field triage, that version isn't better, Marcus. That's just a version where you manage your behavior because of what I can do for you, which is not the same as treating me like a person. He stood there. She said, Is there something you'd like to say to me? Not about tonight. Something you actually mean. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry. And it sounded, to anyone listening to Francis Albright, 2 seats down, who was listening without appearing to listen, which she had been doing for 40 years, like the word of a man saying something for the first time in a very long time. Something that had been available to him all along and that he had been choosing in his specific and habitual way not to say. Delia looked at him for a moment. She said, Thank you. She meant it precisely, not warmly, not with performance of warmth. Just, the thing is registered. I heard it. Now we are on the other side of it. He went back to where Cressida was sitting with their bags. Cressida did not speak to Delia. Cressida never spoke to Delia. What Cressida would eventually produce 14 days later, after Derek Holt's clip had been seen by 2 million people, and shared by several people Cressida did business with and had raised, specifically, the boarding incident was a statement, released through the public relations firm she used for precisely this kind of situation, that described the incident as a miscommunication and expressed her profound respect for all medical and scientific professionals. It said, very precisely, nothing that Cressida had not vetted through 3 lawyers. It said, very precisely, nothing that was an apology. And it was received by the 2 million people who had now seen the clip with the specific silence that a statement earns when it says exactly what it means to say. Derek Holt took down the clip. He took it down at 4 a.m. in the New Orleans Gate area, when his phone had been ringing for 2 hours, and the 40,000 had become 400,000 views, and the replies were not what he had expected, and 2 investors had sent him texts that were not questions. He took it down. But the clip had already been screenshotted and reshared in the way of things that are no longer the property of the person who made them. He did not approach Delia. He sat with his phone in the gate area and he looked at it, and he thought about what he had been doing and what he had been doing it for. And he did not come up with answers that satisfied him. And he sat with the not satisfying for a long time. It was not enough. Taking a thing down was not the same as not having put it up. But it was something, and the something was the beginning of a longer process that Derek was going to have to go through, whether he chose to or not, because the world had seen what he thought was content and had decided, without asking him, that it was evidence of something. In the gate area, with an hour before the rebooked flight, Delia finally took the evidence envelope out of her pocket. Imani was awake beside her, had been awake, watching all of it, with the specific steady watchfulness of a 14-year-old who had traveled from Accra to Atlanta alone to participate in the legal finalization of her grandmother's identification, and who had, in the last 3 weeks, understood more about the world than some people understood in a decade. Delia held out the envelope. I've been trying to find the right moment, she said. Imani looked at it. Is that from her? From the letter she was carrying. Delia said, the GBI preserved it. They thought the family might want a piece. You don't have to take it now. You don't have to take it at all. If it doesn't feel right. Imani looked at the envelope for a long time. She was 14, and her grandmother had been 23 when she died. And there was a specific vertigo in that arithmetic that Delia had seen on the faces of families many times. The realization that the dead had been young once. Younger than you. Younger than you might be now. That the distance between them was not as large as death had made it seem. She said, my mother said she was writing a letter home when she stopped. She was, Delia said, She was partway through it. We don't have the whole letter, but this is a piece of the paper she was writing on. It was in her hand. Imani was quiet. She said, "What did the part we have say?" Delia said, "She was describing the flight over. She was describing what it looked like from the window. She said the clouds from the plane looked like the cloth her mother used to hang on the line to dry. She said they were the same color, the same weight. All that white." She paused. She was writing to her mother about what white clouds looked like from a plane window. She wanted her mother to see it too. Imani sat with this. She was 14 years old and she was sitting in a gate in New Orleans with a piece of her grandmother's letter in a sealed envelope, and outside the windows it was nearly dawn. The sky going from black to the specific dark blue that came before the light. And she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Can I hold it?" Delia put it in her hand. She held it, just held it. The piece of paper her grandmother had been touching when the world stopped. Frances Albright, 2 seats over, was reading her legal pad. She was not watching. She had the gift that judges developed, of being present without intruding, of holding a space without taking it up. She was there. And she was not there. And she was both at once, which was the only way to sit with this kind of moment. Delia watched Imani hold the envelope, and she thought about the work, about the specific thing she had spent 20 years doing, which was not digging, though she dug. Though she got red clay in the creases of her shoes and not the lab work, though she did the lab work too. The specific thing was the moment between, the moment after you had done the identification. After you knew who, when you had to decide how to carry the knowledge back to the living, how to hand it over, what the living needed from the knowing, whether they needed the whole of it or only a piece, and which piece, and how. She had been making that decision for 20 years. She had been wrong about it. Sometimes, she had given people things they were not ready for, and she had withheld things they deserved to have sooner. And she had tried, each time, to learn from the getting it wrong, so the next time she would get it slightly more right. She thought she had gotten this one right. The piece of the letter, the way Imani was holding it, she thought she had gotten this one right. The flight to Accra was the next evening. They had missed the connections. The airline had rebooked them through London on the morning flight, and then on to Accra the following night. And Delia had called the university, and called Imani's mother, and arranged the arrangements. Frances Albright was also rerouted through London. She was going to a conference in Edinburgh. And it turned out that the rerouting aligned, and she was on the same morning flight and sat across the aisle from Delia and Imani on the way to London, and spoke to Imani for an hour about what judges did and what forensic anthropologists did, and how they fit together in the specific machinery of what happened when a person was found after a long absence. Imani listened with the watchful attentiveness that she had brought to everything. And she asked the kind of questions that made Frances and Delia look at each other briefly across the aisle with the specific recognition of adults who have encountered a young person who is going to be very good at something. At London, in the transit lounge, Imani asked Delia, "Is this why you do it? Bringing someone back to their family?" Delia thought about this. It was not the first time she'd been asked the question. And she had several answers that were all true. And she thought about which one was right. For Imani in a transit lounge in London with a connecting flight to Accra in 3 hours. She said, "I do it because the dead deserve to be named. Because there is something I can't entirely explain it. But something that is wrong about a person being in the ground without anyone knowing they are there. There is an accounting that the world owes to every person who lived in it. And when the accounting has been missed, when someone has been lost and the record has them as lost, I do the work of putting them back in the record. Of saying, here. She was here. She had a name. She was traveling home. She was 23 and she was writing a letter about clouds. Imani was quiet. Then she said, I think I want to study forensic anthropology. Delia looked at her. I mean, Imani said, carefully, I'm 14. I might change my mind, but I think I want to understand how you read the bones, how you can tell who a person was from what's left. Delia said, it takes a long time to learn, and it's hard. It's hard in the specific way that the hardest things are hard, which is that the difficulty doesn't go away, you just get better at being in it. Are you okay with that? My grandmother was missing for 34 years and nobody found her until 2 weeks ago. Imani said, I know about being in the difficulty. Delia looked at her for a moment. Then she said, when you're ready for university, write to me. I'll write a letter. Imani looked at her. She said, you've known me for 2 days. I've known enough, Delia said. In Accra, 2 days later, Imani was met by her mother, Precious Osei, who had spent 6 weeks unable to be in Atlanta for the proceedings, who had called Delia from a lawyer's office and asked for the things she needed, was at the arrivals gate at Kotoka International with her hands at her mouth and her eyes on the door. And when Imani came through the door, Precious went toward her in the specific way of mothers who have been holding themselves together across an ocean for 6 weeks and are now allowed to stop holding. Delia watched from the side. She did not intrude. She had learned 20 years ago that this moment, the moment of the returning, the moment of the living reaching the living who had made the journey on behalf of the dead, was not for her. She was the one who made it possible. That was different from belonging to it. She had a flight back to Atlanta that evening. She had the Forsyth case's final lab analysis to finish, the site report to write, the 27 years of a woman's absence to put fully into the record so that the record would be correct and the woman would be permanently and officially known. She had work. She always had work. She went to find her gate. But first, Precious had seen her, had crossed the arrivals hall toward her, and Delia had opened her mouth to say times, please don't. The work is the work. You don't need to. Precious said, she told me what happened on the plane. She told me about the man. She told me what you did. Which part? Delia said. All of it. Precious said. She told me all of it. She stood in front of Delia in the Accra arrivals hall and she said, you went to the ground to find my mother. You sat in that courtroom. You put her in the record. You brought my daughter home across an ocean. And then you saved a man's life on the plane. She paused. Imani says she wants to do what you do. She might change her mind. Delia said. She's 14. She might, Precious said, but I hope she doesn't. She took Delia's hand in both of hers. She held it. She said, thank you for finding her. Thank you for knowing her name. Thank you for knowing that she was carrying a letter, and that the letter was to her mother, and that she was looking at clouds. Delia looked at her. She was looking at clouds, Precious said, and thinking of home. She knew where home was. She was going back someday. She just didn't get to go back. She was crying, quietly. The specific quiet crying of a woman who had had 6 weeks to prepare for this moment and had found, arriving at it, that preparation was irrelevant. But you know she was going home. You know what she was thinking. That matters. It matters so much that you know. Delia stood in the arrivals hall in Accra and let the knowing of it land. 'Cause that was what you did. You let it land. The specific weight of the work. The knowing. The having been there. And then you picked it up again. And you carried it forward to the next one. Because that was what the work was. She said, I know. And now you know. That's why we do it. So that someone always knows. She went to find her gate. She had work. She always had work. The dead were still in the ground. Many of them. Waiting to be named. Waiting for the specific attention of the woman who sat with the evidence long enough to hear what it said. And the woman was coming. She was always coming. She had red clay in the creases of her shoes, and a flight to catch, and 20 years of this behind her, and however many ahead. And she was going to spend them all the same way, in the ground, with the brush, with the calipers, with the patient and unglamorous and necessary work of bringing the lost ones back, on by one, by name. Let me tell you about Paul Griffith, because he is the one who is hardest to write about, and the hardest ones are usually the most important. Paul had been in the air for 30 years. He had seen 1,000 boardings, and he had moved 100 people from the front of the plane to the back. And he had done it every time, with folded hands and the word times, perhaps times, and the smooth manner of a man who had been trained, across 30 years, to manage comfort. The comfort of the people whose comfort was valued, and the discomfort of the people who noticed. He had walked Delia from 4A toward the back of the plane, and he had stopped midway when she had said the specific true thing about complaints and formalization. And he had retreated. And he had told himself, in the language he used for himself, that he had times made a judgment, call times and times, assessed the situation times and times, determined that the conflict could be de-escalated without requiring a seat change. He had very good language for himself. He had 30 years of it. And then at midnight over the Gulf, a woman with red clay in her shoes had gone to row 7 and kept a man alive. Paul had been on many flights where a passenger was in medical distress. He had twice had passengers who died before the plane could divert. He had the training, the AED certification, the checklist. What he had not had, on any of those flights, was the specific competence that Delia had brought, the field experience, the triage knowledge, the calm of someone who had been the only person available and had learned that being the only person available was simply a fact you worked with. He had watched her work. He had handed her the AED when she asked for it and done what she said to do. And he had been, for the first time in a medical emergency in the air, the assistant rather than the one running the process. He was glad to be the assistant. He had been glad in a way that showed him something about the other times, about the specific relief of having someone who was more qualified than him, taking the lead, which was a relief he had never been offered before in this context. After the diversion, in the gate area, Paul sat in one of the crew chairs near the gate agent desk, and he sat with himself. He had almost moved her to the back. He had been in the process of doing it. She had stopped it herself, with the specific, unbothered directness of a woman who had done it before, who had been moved before and had at some point decided she was done being moved. He thought about the times he had moved people, the times they had not stopped it, the times they had looked at him with the look he now recognized, the look of a person absorbing an insult. They had received enough times to have a procedure for absorbing it, and had picked up their bags and walked to the back, without a word, because they had learned that the front was not worth the cost of staying in it. How many of them had been the person you needed when the thing happened at row 7? He did not know. He could not know. That was the point of the way he had been operating. He had been making decisions about who belonged where, without any information, beyond the information his eyes gave him, in 30 seconds at the door. And the information his eyes gave him had been wrong about Delia. And the wrongness had been on record since Marcus Hale opened his mouth and now had 2 million witnesses. He was going to retire in 3 years. He had been thinking of the retirement fondly, the specific fond, thinking of a man who had given enough to a job that he was looking forward to setting it down. He was still going to retire in 3 years. But the 3 years before the retirement were going to be different, because he was going to spend them doing the specific, undramatic work of changing one thing, of not moving the person, of finding, instead, the language for the other thing, for the situation where the cruelty was the problem, and addressing the cruelty was the solution, which was a harder thing to do, and which he had 30 years of practice at not doing. He was going to practice the other thing instead. That was all. That was the whole of Paul Griffith's story. And it was small, and it mattered. Because Paul Griffith ran the front of an airplane multiple times a week, and the people in those airplanes deserved the other thing and had not always gotten it. James Reardon woke up in a hospital in New Orleans 2 days after the flight. His wife Elaine was there. She had not slept in the 2 days. The sleep could wait. The sleep could wait as long as it needed to wait. He said, when he was coherent, "What happened?" She told him what had happened. The arrest. The AED. The woman with the clay in her shoes who had known what to do. She told him about the name Dr. Adayeze Emeka, forensic anthropologist, and he repeated it the way people repeated the names of the people they needed to remember. He said, "A forensic anthropologist." "Yes," Elaine said. "They ID the dead." He said, "Yes." "She saved a live one," he said. Elaine said, "She did." He lay in the hospital bed in New Orleans, and he thought about that, the specificity of it. The specific irony. Or maybe not irony, but something richer than irony. Something like the world having its own sense of what was needed and providing it without announcement. The woman who spent her life on the ground with the dead had been in row 4 when his heart stopped. The woman who knew how to read a body's silence had been awake at midnight and heard his. He asked Elaine to help him write a letter. He was not a writer. He was a property developer from Houston, and his vocabulary for gratitude was limited. And he spent a long time on the letter, and it was still not the right words. But it said what he meant, which was, "You did not know me, and I was nothing to you except a man in row 7 who stopped cooperating. And you went to row 7, and you brought me back. And I am going to be alive for years because of what you did. And I need you to know that I know that. And that I will not waste the years." He sent it to the airline, which forwarded it to Delia's university address. She read it in Atlanta, at her desk. Between the site report and the lab analysis, she read it twice. She filed it in the folder where she kept the letters, the thank you letters, the family letters, the letters from the living and the letters from the people speaking for the dead. She had a thick folder. She went back to the lab analysis. There was a woman from Forsyth County in the record now, and the record was being finalized. And Delia was the one who would write the final report that made the identification official and closed the 31 years of the file and opened the 31 years of the family finally having an answer. She wrote the report. She wrote it with the same care she brought to all of it, the same patient. Unglamorous. Necessary care. The dead woman's name was in the report. Her approximate age at death. The cause. The estimated date. The manner. The evidence. All the evidence. Every piece of the evidence that Delia had spent 6 days in the ground and 3 weeks in the lab, accumulating so that the report would be as complete as the evidence allowed, and the woman would be as known as a document could make her. She filed it. She went home. She did not think of herself as a person who saved lives. She thought of herself as a person who did the work. The work of the ground and the lab and the report. The work of field triage, when field triage was what the situation was. The work of handing over the piece of paper to the 14-year-old in the gate area in New Orleans. The work of sitting in 4A and not getting up when a man said she was not what first class was supposed to contain. The work was what she had. And the work was enough. And she did it every day. And she was going to keep doing it. And the days were going to accumulate into a career, and the career was going to accumulate into a life that had looked at the ground and read what was there and brought the names back. On by on, into the light. Un by un, by name. Always by name. Imani Ose enrolled at the University of Ghana at 18. She studied biology, then physical anthropology. She wrote to Delia in her second year with a question about bone mineral density analysis and the decomposition variables in tropical climates. And Delia wrote back 4 paragraphs and attached 2 papers and said, "Good question. Ask me the next one." She asked the next one. And the next. Over 4 years, there were 42 questions and 42 answers. And at the end of 4 years, Imani sent a 1-sentence email that said, "I was accepted to the master's program at Michigan. You said you'd write a letter. You did." Delia wrote back, "Go learn everything. Come back with questions I can't answer. That's the goal." Imani went to Michigan. She came back with questions Delia couldn't always answer. She became a forensic anthropologist. She worked cases in Ghana and Nigeria and Sierra Leone. The specific and necessary work of naming the unnamed in places where the unnamed were many and the namers were few. She had a folder of letters on her desk. She had started it the day she received the first letter from a family she had helped. She kept it the same way. Delia kept hers not as pride, not as performance, but as the record of the work. The specific evidence that the work mattered and that the mattering was real. She had, on her desk, a sealed evidence envelope, small, the size of a playing card. Inside it, a piece of fabric from a letter her grandmother had been writing home in 1989, a letter about clouds, a letter to her mother, a letter that said she was going home someday. Imani looked at it sometimes. When the work was hard, when the record felt too heavy to hold, she looked at the envelope and she thought about the woman who had handed it to her in a gate area in New Orleans at 4 a.m, who had told her that the dead deserved to be named, who had spent 20 years in the ground and 30 minutes at row 7 and 2 days crossing an ocean to bring a 14-year-old home. She thought about the work. She went back to it. She always went back to it. Dr. Adaeze Emeka, 22 years into the career and counting, is not famous. She has not been on television. She has not written a popular book. She has testified in 23 murder trials and worked mass grave sites on 4 continents and written 112 lab reports and been the first call for 6 different police departments and been the last call, sometimes when the departments had run out of other calls to make. She has clay in the creases of her shoes most of the time. She has an evidence envelope in her chest pocket, always different ones. Always. The current case. Whatever piece of the current case she is carrying, to remind herself of what the work is for, who it is for, what the work costs the people who need it, and the cost, therefore, of doing it badly. She has a folder of letters. She adds to it. She still has the field bag, the canvas one. Olive. 1 strap replaced with webbing. She has had it for 16 years. She has been asked more times than she can count why she doesn't get a better bag. A nicer bag. A bag that reads as what she is credentialed. Accomplished. The specific authority of 22 years of this specific work. She has a settled relationship with this question. She says, it is a better bag. This bag has been on 4 continents. This bag has been in the ground at 2 mass grave sites and in a lab at the GBI and in a gate area in New Orleans at 4 in the morning. This bag went to Accra. This is exactly the bag I need. She goes back to the ground. She always goes back to the ground. The work is there. The names are there. The dead are still in the earth, waiting. And Delia is coming. She is always coming. One by one. By name, there is one more thing to say, and it is about the thing Cressida Hale said on the airplane. The words that went in deeper for being quiet. She said, "It's not a first-class bag. That's a bag you fish out of a dumpster behind a bus station." She said, "You smell like a wet campfire someone tried to put out with cheap coffee." She said, "You don't argue with a smudge on the manifest. You just wait for someone to wipe it off." I want you to hold those sentences for a moment, because they are the sentences that the Cressidas of the world believe are safe to say, the sentences delivered in the quieter voice. The lawyered voice. The voice that makes the same decision as the louder voice, but wraps it in the register that is harder to object to. The register that says, "I am not crude. I am merely accurate. And what I am saying is not hostility. It is assessment. And the assessment is simply that you are less." These are the sentences that do not make the news the way Marcus's loudness makes the news. These are the sentences that the clip does not always catch. These are the sentences that the woman receiving them has absorbed across 44 years, so many times and in so many forms, from committees, from courtrooms, from airport terminals and conference dinners, that she has developed a procedure for absorbing them. A specific and efficient procedure that allows her to put the bag in the overhead bin and sit in her seat and take out the evidence envelope and look out the window at the Atlanta tarmac and not give any of it more than it is owed. Which is not nothing, which is the smallest possible amount, which is, I heard it. I named it to myself. And now I am going to do the work. The work, in the end, is the answer to all of it. Not because the work erases the sentences are there. They have been said. They have been absorbed. They are in the record. But because the work is larger than the sentences, and longer than the sentences, and the sentences are said once and forgotten by the people who say them, and the work goes on for 22 years and counting, and the work names the unnamed and brings the lost back, and crosses the ocean with the granddaughter of a woman who was carrying a letter about clouds, and the work saves the man in row 7, and hands the piece of paper to the 14-year-old in the gate area, and writes the letter for the student at Michigan who has questions that take 4 paragraphs to answer. The work is the whole of it. Cressida Hale issued a statement through a firm. The statement said nothing she meant. The statement was, like all such statements, a document in which a person told you who they were while appearing to tell you who they wished they were. It told you, clearly, that Cressida Hale was someone who, given the opportunity to be the thing she had pretended to be in the statement, had chosen instead to issue the statement, "Dr. Adaize Emeka is currently at a site in Fulton County. She has clay in the creases of her shoes. She has an evidence envelope in her chest pocket. She has the field bag with the replaced strap. She is in the ground. She is listening. She is going to hear what the evidence says. And she is going to bring it back. And she is going to put it in the record. And the record is going to be correct. And the person who was in the ground is going to be known. Un by un. By name. That's the whole thing. That's everything. That's enough. Samuel Boateng flew on to wherever he was flying to. And he did not make a production of what had happened at row 7. He was 67 years old, and he had been doing surgery for 38 years. And he had the specific relationship with crisis that 38 years of surgery produced the relationship that was not heroism and not performance, but competence. The thing that competence became when it had been practiced long enough to stop being something you did and start being something you were. He had done compressions. He had done them for as long as they were needed. He had handed off cleanly to the ground team. He had. In the gate area in New Orleans. Told Paul Griffith 3 things clearly. Not unkindly. In the specific voice of a man who has no time for the long version about the AED protocol and about what Paul should have done differently and about a conversation Paul should consider having with his airline about updating the galley crew certification. He was not trying to be difficult. He was trying to make it better. That was what 38 years of surgery did. It made you constitutionally unable to leave a correctable thing uncorrected. Because the correctable thing became the uncorrectable thing if you left it. And the uncorrectable thing cost something. And he had spent 38 years learning what the costing felt like. Paul listened. He wrote down the 3 things on the back of a boarding pass. He submitted a formal improvement note to the airline's operations team the following week. Samuel got on the next flight. He had an appointment. He had not introduced himself to Marcus Hale. And he did not. He had watched the boarding situation and formed an opinion and kept the opinion to himself. And then he had been up and moving when James Reardon stopped and had done the compressions and handed off cleanly. And that was the whole of his involvement from his perspective. He had, at one point in the gate area, made eye contact with Delia, the specific, brief acknowledgement of 2 people who have been in the same room with the same emergency and have both done their part. 2 seconds. A nod. Then they had gone back to their own business. Because the business was theirs, and the moment was the moment's, and there was nothing to perform about any of it. That was the whole of Samuel Boateng's story. He did his part. He moved on. He was 67 years old and had 38 years behind him and possibly 20 ahead. And he was going to spend all of them the same way, doing the part that was his to do and not making a production of the doing. The man who had stopped compressing his chest because the rhythm came back was alive. The surgeon's hands had done that. The surgeon was on a different plane now, going where he was going. The work continues in many hands. That is the only way the work continues. The last thing to say is about the ground. Delia goes into the ground. That is the job. She takes her brushes and her dental picks and her calipers and her grid stakes and she goes into the earth and she sits with what is there. She is patient in the way that the work requires, which is the specific patience of someone who has learned that the evidence will tell you what it tells you in the time it takes to tell it, and that hurrying the telling means missing part of what is told. She has been in the ground in Rwanda and Bosnia and 12 American states. She has been in the ground in weather that was 40 below, and weather that was 110, and weather that had no name in English. She has been in the ground alone and with teams, and with students, and with detectives, waiting at the edge of the grid to hear what the grid produced. Every time she goes into the ground, she carries the envelope. The current one, whatever piece of the current case she is carrying to remind herself of what the work is for. She opens it sometimes, at the site, when the work is hard or slow, or when it has been hard and slow for long enough that she needs the reminder of the specific person waiting for the result. She does not open the envelope she carried on Flight 204 anymore. That one is closed. Akua Ose has been named, is in the record, is known, known to the GBI and to the Fulton County DA, and to the man currently serving time, and to the death certificate that was 34 years late, and to the living family in Accra, and to the 14-year-old who is now a forensic anthropologist in her own right, and who has, on her own desk, in Accra, a folder of letters and an evidence envelope from a letter about clouds. That case is closed. Delia has other envelopes. She always has other envelopes. The ground always has more. She goes back to it. She always goes back to it. She is in the ground right now, somewhere in Georgia, with a brush and a grid, and the patient competence of 22 years, reading what the evidence says, waiting for the name. The name will come. It always comes. Eventually. To the woman who is patient enough to wait for it. It always comes. She is waiting. She is always waiting. She will find it. She always finds it. That is the work. That is all the work has ever been. By one. By name. The man in 4B set down his glass and adjusted his cufflinks with the tight, aggressive rhythm of a man who needed the whole cabin to know how much his time cost. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is acceptable, Marcus Hale said, his voice carrying clearly into row 5 and row 6, where 2 off-duty flight crew members were trying to sleep. We paid for first class. We paid for the space, the quiet, and the expectation that we wouldn't be forced to share a row with whatever this is. He gestured vaguely at Delia's canvas bag on the floor, then at the clay embedded in the heel of her leather shoe. I mean, look at her hands. Is that dirt under the nails? Did the airline scoop her up from a highway roadwork crew and hand her a ticket just to fill the cabin? Beside him, Cressida Hale didn't look up from her tablet. Her voice was smoother, lower, and considerably meaner. It's field equipment. Marcus. She's one of those university people. They let dig around in the dirt for public grant money. Probably bones. Digging up people who've been dead 100 years and writing papers nobody reads. And then using state funds to ruin the air quality in row 4. She tilted her head toward Delia with a slight, theatrical flare of her nostrils. Am I close? Honey? Or did you just forget to wash before you boarded? Delia didn't look at them. She reached down, pulled the canvas bag an inch closer to her knee, and checked the small, flat evidence envelope in her chest pocket. The envelope was sealed with red tape, the paper slightly creased at the corner from being carried across 3 states. Inside, it was a fragment of linen, a 3-inch square cut from a letter written in 1989 by a 23-year-old woman named Akua Ose, who had come to Georgia from Ghana to study nursing and had vanished into the red dirt behind an old motel in Forsyth County. Seat 4A, Delia said. Her voice was flat, level, and low. Excuse me. She stepped past Marcus's knees. He didn't move them to make room. He forced her to press past his legs. His expression, a study in theatrical disgust, as if her trousers might transfer a disease onto his wool trousers. Delia sat down in 4A. Beside her, asleep against the window with her forehead pressed against the double-paned glass, was 14-year-old Imani Ose. Imani was Akua's granddaughter. She had flown in from Accra 4 days ago with a legal guardian to sign the final identification papers at the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office. And now Delia was taking her home. Delia adjusted the air vent above Imani's head, directing the cool stream away from the girl's face. She didn't check her reflection in the dark glass. She didn't look back at Marcus. She had spent 24 years in cold pits, in mass graves in Bosnia. in shallow culverts in South Georgia, and in air-conditioned courtrooms where defense attorneys tried to rattle her by asking if her hands were dirty when she handled the evidence. She knew what her hands were. From row 5, the senior flight attendant, Paul Griffith, 56 years old, 30 years with the carrier. His back stiff from 3 decades of pushing carts up inclined aisles, approached row 4 with his hands folded in front of his waist. He had the smooth, cautious expression of a man who had spent 30 years managing small, ugly conflicts by shifting the easiest person out of the way. "Excuse me, ma'am," Paul said, leaning over Delia with a practiced, sympathetic tilt of his head. "I wonder if we might move you and the young lady to something a bit more comfortable in the main cabin? We have a row near the front of Economy Plus where you'd have more legroom. And it might smooth things out for everyone involved." Delia looked up at him. She didn't raise her chin. She didn't lower her eyes. "Paul," she said, reading the silver name tag pinned to his navy blazer. "Is that your name?" "Yes, ma'am. I am Dr. Adayeze Emeka," she said. Her voice didn't carry into row 6, but it filled the space between them with absolute, immovable weight. "I am in seat 4A. The child in 4B is 14 years old. She is traveling under my care, and her grandmother's remains were released to her family 6 hours ago after 35 years in the ground. We are staying in row 4. If this gentleman has a formal complaint about my shoes, you may write it down on a passenger report form and hand it to me at the gate in Dallas. Is there a formal complaint?" "Paul?" Paul Griffith looked from Delia's eyes to Marcus Hale's face. Marcus was suddenly very busy with his phone, his thumb flicking across the screen with aggressive speed. No longer looking at Paul. No longer looking at Delia. Paul cleared his throat. The smooth, managerial posture collapsed inward by an inch. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "No complaint. Let me know if I can bring you or the young lady some water." "Water would be fine," Delia said, and turned her face back toward the window. The Airbus, a 321, climbed through 20,000 feet, turning west over the black, featureless void of the North Georgia hills. The cabin lights dimmed to a low, amber night setting. Across the aisle in 4C, a young venture capitalist named Derek Holt had his phone held at chest height. The screen dimmed to minimum brightness. He had recorded the entire exchange, Marcus's monologue, Cressida's nasal commentary, Paul's gentle retreat, and Delia's 3-sentence response. His thumb was already hovering over the upload button on a draft post for his 60,000 followers. First-class flight from ATL getting wild. Lady with Georgia, red clay on her boots, just put a corporate VP in his place. He clicked send. In row pent. Directly behind Marcus sat Dr. Samuel Boateng. He was 67 years old, broad-shouldered, with thick, silvering hair and the dark, heavy hands of a retired chief of thoracic surgery who had spent 38 years in university hospitals in Chicago and London. He had watched Delia board. He had seen the way she held her canvas bag, not like luggage, but like a kit. He had seen the calipers sticking out of the side pocket, the small brass scale weights in their wooden box, the grease pencil marks on the canvas strap. He hadn't said a word during the argument. Surgery had taught him that when two people were making noise, the person who wasn't making noise was usually the one who knew what they were doing. The flight reached 34,000 feet over the Alabama line when the call button in row 7 lit up with 3 sharp insistence chimes. Paul Griffith came up the aisle from the mid-galley. His cart stopped near row 6. In seat 7B, James Reardon, 61 years old. A commercial real estate developer from Houston who had eaten 2 steaks at the airport lounge and drank 3 gin tonics before boarding was no longer looking at his in-flight movie. His head was tilted back against the headrest, his eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling panel, his lower jaw working in silent, erratic spasms. His wife, Elina, was pulling at his arm, making a thin, high-pitched whistling sound through her teeth. That wasn't a word. James, she was saying. James, look at me. James, stop doing that. Paul. Help him! Paul reached row 7 in 3 strides. He took one look at James Reardon's face, the gray, mottled color creeping up from the collar of his shirt, the complete absence of chest movement, and froze. Dr. Boateng, Delia said. She was out of seat 4A before Paul had touched Reardon's pulse. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look at Marcus, who was leaning out into the aisle to see what was delaying the cart. Samuel Boateng was already behind her. His broad frame filled the narrow passage between rows 5 and 6. Get him on the floor, Samuel said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the specific, cold authority of an operating room commander during a bleed. Paul, drop the seats, clear the aisle, move the cart back. Paul's hands were shaking as he reached for Reardon's seatbelt. Delia reached past Paul, unbuckled the metal latch with one hand, and took Reardon under the shoulders. Samuel, take his legs. Together, they dragged James Reardon out of the narrow seat and laid him flat on his back in the center aisle between row 6 and row 7. His eyes were half open, fixed on the overhead reading lights, his skin already taking on the waxy, blue-gray tint of a body that had stopped circulating oxygen 3 minutes before his brain realized it. Samuel went to his knees in the aisle, his dark hands interlocking over Reardon's sternum. Narrated, Samuel said flatly. Rhythm's gone. He's in full arrest. He began compressions 1, 2, 3, 4, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his palms against the rib cage audible over the low drone of the jet engines. Delia didn't ask Samuel what he needed. She turned on her heel, reached into her canvas field bag under seat 4A, and pulled out her headlamp. She snapped it onto her forehead, clicked the LED switch to its highest beam, and knelt at Reardon's head. Airway, she said. She tilted Reardon's chin up, cleared his mouth with 2 gloved fingers. She had pulled nitrile gloves from her pocket without thinking, and reached back toward Paul, who was standing frozen against seat 6C, his face as white as his shirt. Paul, Delia said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. The medical kit. The automated external defibrillator. It's in the overhead above 1C. Bring it now. Paul didn't move for 2 seconds. Paul! Samuel barked, not breaking the count of his compressions. Move! Paul turned and ran toward the front galley. In seat 4B, Marcus Hale was leaning over the back of his chair, his phone still in his hand, his mouth slightly open. He looked at Delia at the bright white beam of her headlamp cutting through the dim cabin, at her clay-stained leather shoes braced against the aisle carpet, at her gloved fingers holding James Reardon's jaw in alignment. Is he dead? Marcus asked. The contempt was gone from his voice, replaced by the thin, fragile curiosity of a man who had never seen the border between life and death up close. Delia didn't look back at him. He's non-responsive, she said. her fingers feeling the side of Reardon's neck for the faint, thready flutter of a dying, carotid impulse. Samuel. Pause at 30. Samuel stopped. Delia leaned down, sealed her mouth over Reardon's, and delivered 2 long, steady breaths. Reardon's chest rose, fell, and stayed still. Paul came back down the aisle, stumbling against the seats, carrying the yellow plastic case of the heart defibrillator. He dropped it beside Delia. Delia snapped the latches open. She had recertified her advanced wilderness triage credentials 6 months ago for an excavation in the Delta mud of Mississippi. She didn't need to read the instructions on the lid. She tore open the pad package, peeled the adhesive backing, and slapped the first pad onto Reardon's upper right chest, just below the collarbone. She slapped the second pad onto his lower left ribs. Clear the body. The defibrillator's synthetic voice announced into the silent cabin, analyzing rhythm. Samuel lifted his hands, his dark forearms glistening with sweat. He looked across the body at Delia. Across the aisle, Cressida Hale had pulled her knees up to her chest in seat 4C, her face pressed against the leather seatback, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. She was watching Delia's hands, the calloused, dirt-lined fingers that she had called filthy 20 minutes ago, moving over James Reardon's bare chest with the absolute, unhurried precision of a master technician. Shock advised, the machine stated. Charging. Stand clear. Clear the aisle, Delia said. She didn't shout it. She simply looked up the length of the cabin, her headlamp beam sweeping over Marcus, over Cressida, over Derek Holt, who had dropped his phone onto his lap and was staring at the floor with his jaw clenched. Delia, Samuel said softly. He's been down at least 4 minutes. I know how long he's been down, Delia said. She pressed the orange button. James Reardon's body lurched, his back arching 3 inches off the blue carpet as the charge passed through his heart. His feet kicked out once, striking the base of seat 6B. Then he collapsed back onto the floor, flat and still. Resume CPR. The machine instructed. Samuel immediately leaned back over the chest, his hands locking together again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Delia reached into her pocket, pulled out a small penlight, and lifted Reardon's left eyelid. Pupils are fixed, she said to Samuel. Right pupil is 4 millimeters. Left is 4 millimeters. No light reflex yet. Give me 2 more cycles. Elaine Reardon, still sitting in 7A, made a low, wet sound and buried her face in her hands. Please, she whispered to the carpet. Please. Somebody. He has 3 grandchildren. Please. For 12 minutes, row 6 was the center of the world. The Airbus continued its long, steady arc over the black farms of Mississippi toward Dallas. But inside the cabin, the air had grown thick with the smell of sweat, copper, and the cold, metallic ozone of the discharge. Samuel was on his 4th set of 100-count compressions. His breath was coming in ragged gasps, his gray hair damp against his forehead. Let me take over, Delia said. I have it. Samuel grunted. 38. 39. 40. Samuel, let me take over. You need to check his airway. Samuel paused, wiped his brow with his sleeve, and stepped back on his knees. Delia immediately took his position over Reardon's chest. She didn't look like an academic now. She didn't look like a university employee with dirt under her nails. Her shoulders were set, her back straight, her hands coming down on Reardon's sternum with the heavy, rhythmic, mechanical force of a hydraulic press. She knew the human skeleton from the inside out. She knew exactly how much force was required to depress the sternum 2 inches without fracturing the costal cartilage of a 61-year-old male. And she delivered that force with absolute, terrifying consistency. 1, 2, 3, 4. In seat 4B, Marcus Hale was watching her hands. He couldn't take his eyes off them. He watched the knuckles white under the strain. Dark clay, still visible in the fine creases around the cuticles as they drove down into Reardon's chest. Again and again, refusing to let the man's heart stay still. He remembered what he had said 20 minutes ago. Is that dirt under her fingernails? Did they let a gravedigger into first class? He felt a sudden, cold sickness in the back of his throat that had nothing to do with the altitude. Analyzing rhythm, the machine said again. Delia lifted her hands. Stop compressions. The cabin went dead silent. The only sound was the low, 300-mile-an-hour rush of the wind against the aluminum skin of the fuselage. The defibrillator hummed. A small red light flashed twice on its console. No shock advised. The synthetic voice said, check pulse. If no pulse, resume CPR. Samuel's fingers went to Reardon's neck. He held them there for 3 seconds. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. He looked at Delia. He shook his head once. Very slightly. Rhythm is asystole. Samuel whispered, he's gone. Delia didn't stop. She didn't look at Samuel. She didn't look at Elaine Reardon. She reached down, took James Reardon's jaw in her gloved right hand, and tilted his head back another 5 degrees. He's not gone, Delia said. Her voice was so low it was almost a hum. He's just quiet. Samuel, give me the bag valve mask from the kit. Delia, give me the mask. Dr. Boateng. Samuel reached into the yellow kit, pulled out the clear silicone mask and the blue resuscitation bag, and handed it to her. Delia fitted the mask over Reardon's nose and mouth, creating a tight seal with her thumb and forefinger. Compress the bag, she said. Samuel squeezed. Air whistled into Reardon's lungs. Delia reached down with her left hand, placed her index and middle fingers precisely over the femoral artery in Reardon's right groin, a landmark she had dissected 500 times in anatomy labs and identified in 50 cold case recoveries, and pressed down hard through his trousers. There, she said. Samuel froze. What? There, Delia repeated. He's not in asystole. He's in fine ventricular fibrillation. The pads aren't picking it up because the skin impedance is too high. He's sweating too much. She tore the pads off Reardon's chest with 2 sharp snaps. She took a dry napkin from Paul Griffith's tray, wiped Reardon's sternum and ribs until the skin was completely dry, and slapped a fresh pair of pads onto his chest. Reanalyze, she said to the machine. The yellow box hummed again. The red light flickered, turned green, and stayed green. Shock advised. The box announced, charging. Elaine Reardon let out a short, choked gasp. Clear, Delia said. She pressed the orange button a second time. James Reardon's body didn't just lurch, his shoulders slammed back against the carpet. His chest expanded with a sharp, ragged, whistling intake of air, and then his eyes opened. They weren't fixed anymore. They were wide, bloodshot, and rolling wildly from side to side as his chest began to heave on its own, his heart striking against his ribs with a sudden, violent, erratic rhythm that was loud enough for Samuel to hear without a stethoscope. Pulse, Samuel said, his fingers on the carotid. His voice was shaking. Carotid pulse is back. Strong. 110. He's breathing. Delia didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She reached down, took Reardon's hand in her gloved left hand, and held it firmly. "Mr. Reardon," she said, leaning her headlamp beam directly into his field of vision. "My name is Dr. Emeka. You're on an airplane. You had a cardiac event. But you're back now. Don't try to talk. Just look at me." James Reardon's fingers tightened around hers. He didn't let go. The Airbus landed at Jackson Medgar Wiley Evers International Airport in Jackson, Mississippi. 40 minutes later, after an emergency descent that had the engines whining at high thrust all the way down through the clouds, when the cabin door opened, 4 city paramedics came through the forward galley with a gurney, their boots loud against the floorboards. They didn't look at Marcus Hale. They didn't look at Cressida. They went straight to row 6, where Delia was still kneeling beside James Reardon, holding his pulse. Her notebook open on her knee with a minute-by-minute log of his heart rate, pad discharges, and pupil responses written in neat, indelible ink. The lead paramedic, a broad-shouldered man with 2 decades on the Jackson squad, looked at the log, then looked at Delia. "Who ran this scene?" he asked. "Doctor. Boateng performed compressions," Delia said, pointing to Samuel, who was sitting in 5C with a bottle of water in his hand, his shirt soaked with sweat. "I managed the airway and the AED. We delivered 2 shocks. Second shock restored sinus rhythm at 0142 UTC. The paramedic looked at the AED pad still attached to Reardon's chest. Then, at the neat handwriting in Delia's book. "You a flight nurse?" he asked. "Forensic anthropologist," Delia said. "I work with the dead." The paramedic paused, looked at Reardon, who was conscious, breathing on his own, and watching Delia with wide, terrified, grateful eyes, and then let out a short, dry laugh. "Well, Doc," the paramedic said, "you missed one." They loaded Reardon onto the gurney and wheeled him out. Elaine Reardon followed them, but at the forward cabin door she stopped, turned around, and looked back down the aisle toward row 4. She didn't say anything to Marcus. She didn't look at Paul Griffith. She looked directly at Delia, who was standing in the aisle with her headlamp now unclipped and held in her hand. Elaine didn't say thank you. She couldn't. She simply put her hand over her heart, held it there for 3 seconds, and then stepped out into the jet bridge. The plane sat on the tarmac in Jackson for an hour while the ground crew refueled and cleared the medical paperwork. The cabin was silent. The low, comfortable murmur that usually filled first class after a delay was completely gone. Marcus Hale sat in Fire B. He hadn't touched his phone since the AED discharged the second time. He hadn't looked at Cressida. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the small, gray canvas bag, under seat 4A. After 40 minutes, he turned his head. "Dr. Emeka," he said. Delia didn't look up from her paperback book. "Yes. Marcus? I want to apologize," he said. His voice was different now. It lacked the smooth, resonant carry it had possessed over Atlanta. It was small, thin, and rough around the edges. "For what I said when you boarded. About your shoes. About what you do." Delia turned a page of her book. "You don't need to apologize to me. Marcus, she said. She didn't say it meanly. She said it with the cold, absolute clarity she used when delivering a courtroom finding to a judge. You didn't insult me. You revealed yourself. Those are two very different things. Marcus's throat moved. I didn't know. That's the point, Delia said, turning her face to look at him directly for the first time since Atlanta. Her brown eyes were calm, heavy, and completely unreadable. You didn't know. You saw a woman with clay on her boots and a stenciled equipment bag. And you assumed she had no value in your world because she didn't look like your world. You manage your respect based on what you think people can do for you. That isn't respect, Marcus. That's just commerce. She looked past him to Cressida, who was staring at her lap, her tablet dark and face down on the tray table. My shoes have red Georgia clay on them, Delia said softly, because I spent 7 hours yesterday in a 4-foot trench behind an abandoned motel in Forsyth County, pulling the third metacarpal of a 23-year-old girl out of the mud so her family could take her home to Ghana. The dirt under my nails is 35 years of Georgia history that somebody tried to hide under an old concrete foundation. She reached into her chest pocket, pulled out the flat evidence envelope, and laid it on the open tray table between them. Inside this envelope, Delia said, is a piece of paper that girl wrote on while she was sitting on a plane, just like this one in 1989. She was writing to her mother about how the clouds looked like white linen hanging on a line in Accra. She didn't get to finish the letter. She looked at Marcus's hands, his clean, manicured, pale hands resting on his knees. I don't care what you think of my shoes, Marcus, she said. The dead don't care about first class. And neither do I. Marcus looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. He looked at it as if it were made of glass that might shatter if he breathed too heavily near it. I'm sorry, he whispered again. Delia didn't answer. She took the envelope, slipped it back into her chest pocket, and closed her paperback. Beside her, Imani woke up. The girl blinked, looked at the bright tarmac lights of Jackson outside the window, and then looked at Delia. Are we there? Imani asked, her voice thick with sleep. Not yet, sweetheart, Delia said, her voice softening into a warmth that Marcus Hale hadn't heard all night. We're in Mississippi. We've got a little further to go. Did something happen? Imani asked. Looking at the open AED case, still sitting near the front galley. Nothing you need to worry about, Delia said, reaching over to smooth the girl's hair back from her forehead. Just a man who needed some help, remembering how to breathe. He's fine now. Imani nodded, leaned her head back against Delia's shoulder, and closed her eyes again. Across the aisle, Dr. Samuel Boateng looked at Delia over his reading glasses. He didn't say anything. He just gave her one slow, heavy nod, the nod of one old worker to another across a finished job, and went back to his book. The Airbus A321 took off from Jackson at 2 a.m, climbing back into the black southern sky toward Texas. In seat 4C, Derek Holt sat with his phone in his hands. The video he had posted at 20,000 feet, the one showing Marcus and Cressida mocking Delia's shoes, had already been viewed 300,000 times while they were on the ground in Mississippi. The comments were filing in at 40 per minute. Derek looked at the draft he had just typed. Update. The lady with the dirt on her shoes just brought a guy back from the dead in row 6 using an AED in her bare hands. Turns out she's a world-renowned forensic surgeon taking a murdered girl's remains home to Africa. He looked at the upload button. Then he looked across the aisle at Delia, who was sitting in the dark with her eyes closed, her hand resting gently over the evidence envelope in her pocket. her breath steady, and even as the plane crossed into Texas airspace, Derek hit dealt. He cleared the draft, turned off his phone, and put it in his pocket. Some things weren't content. Some things were just the work. They landed in Dallas at 3:40 in the morning. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Marcus Hale didn't stand up. He waited in 4B, his briefcase in his lap, while Delia reached up into the overhead bin, retrieved her canvas field bag, and helped Imani put on her light jacket. As Delia stepped into the aisle, Paul Griffith stood near the forward galley. His navy blazer was buttoned, his hair combed back, but he looked 10 years older than he had in Atlanta. "Doctor, Emeka," Paul said quietly as she approached. Delia stopped. "Yes, Paul. I wanted to tell you," Paul said, his hands folded in front of his waist. But his posture no longer managerial, just tired. 30 years I've been doing this. I've moved 100 people out of first class because someone complained about how they looked. I thought I was keeping the peace. He looked down at his own polished black shoes, then up at Delia's clay-stained leather ones. "I won't do it again," Paul said. "Not on my flight." Delia looked at him for a long moment. The amber galley lights caught the fine gray hair at her temples and the small, deep lines around her eyes that came from 20 years of looking closely at things in the sun. "Good," Delia said. "Then James Reardon isn't the only one who got something back tonight." She adjusted the canvas strap on her shoulder, took Imani by the hand, and walked out into the cool, bright air of the terminal. Cruelty in this world is rarely loud. It doesn't always come with a raised fist or a shouted slur. Most of the time, it comes in the quiet, comfortable register of a man checking his watch in seat 4B. It comes from people who have decided that their comfort is the only metric that matters, that the dirt on another person's boots is a personal insult, and that the space they occupy was earned by their wallet rather than their humanity. They look at the canvas bags, the repaired shoes, the calloused hands, and the quiet people who don't shout back. And they assume they are looking at something small. They assume that because a person spends her life in the red dirt, she must belong to the dirt. They never stop to think that the person in the dirt might be the only one in the room who knows how to bring the lost back into the light. They don't know that the hands they are curling their lips at have held the bones of the forgotten, have written the final reports for families who waited 35 years for a name, and can, when the cabin goes dark and the heart in 7B stops beating, drive 24 years of patient, unglamorous competence directly into a dead man's chest and force him to live. The Marcus Hales of the world will always have the first-class tickets. They will always have the leather seats and the law firm-issued statements and the quiet, polite contempt that makes the waiting room feel cold. But when the air gets thin at 34,000 feet, and the pulse goes flat, and the whole comfortable illusion of who belongs where collapses onto the blue aisle carpet, it isn't the ticket that saves you. It's the woman with the red clay on her shoes. If you've ever been made to feel small in a room, you had every right to stand in. If you've ever had someone look at your clothes, your hands, your background, or your work, and decide you were the wrong shape for their horizon, I want you to leave a comment down below and tell me about the moment you proved them wrong. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that real dignity doesn't come from a boarding pass. And subscribe to Black Stories for more scripts about the people who do the heavy, quiet work that keeps this world running. Keep your hands in the dirt. Keep your eyes on the work. And remember, The ground holds everyone eventually, so we might as well treat each other with some grace while we're still walking on top of it. The night shift at Louis Armstrong International Airport was supposed to be a straight run through the departure roster, 8 hours of routine maintenance, 2 fuel system checks, and a quick turn on a charter flight sitting on the south ramp. Instead, Marcus Webb was standing in the cold damp of 3 in the morning with a titanium compressor blade in his right hand and a young engineer beside him whose hands were shaking so hard he couldn't keep the inspection torch still. "Look at the route," Marcus said. His voice was low, clipped. The flat, unhurried register of a man who had spent 19 years listening to the specific frequency of jet engines and knew exactly what they sounded like right before they tore themselves apart. "Don't look at the tip. Look at the trailing edge near the platform." "What do you see?" "Devin?" Devin Atkins. 24 years old and 6 months out of technical school. Leaned his head into the dark of the open engine cowling. The beam of his flashlight flickered across the silver curve of the blade. He swallowed. The sound loud in the quiet of the hangar. It's just a scratch. A tool mark from the last overhaul." "A tool mark runs straight," Marcus said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move his hand. "A tool mark doesn't branch. See those 3 fine lines coming off the main trace? That's a microfracture. It's sitting right in the stress curve. You put 80,000 pounds of thrust behind that tomorrow morning over the Gulf. And by the time that aircraft hits 20,000 feet, that blade isn't a blade anymore. It's shrapnel. It goes through the casing. Takes out the hydraulic lines in the wing. And then everybody on board finds out what a double engine failure feels like over water." Devin pulled his head back out of the cowling, his face pale under the high bay LED lights. I checked that section 10 minutes ago. I looked right at it. I was going to sign the release." "You looked at it," Marcus corrected gently, setting the blade down on the green felt of the inspection tray. "You didn't times C times it. Looking is what you do when you're trying to finish a shift. Seeing is what you do when you remember who's sitting in seat 14B. He reached into the pocket of his navy work trousers, pulled out a small, worn brass caliper, and laid it beside the blade. Beside the caliper was a folded piece of paper, creased at the edges and soft from years of being carried in a pocket next to a man's ribs. It was a drawing. A crayon picture of an airplane with oversized blue wings and a small, crooked figure standing on the tarmac below it, holding a wrench 3 times its size. Across the top, written in the careful, backward-leaning print of an 8-year-old girl, were 6 words: "My dad makes the planes fly." Marcus didn't flip the paper open. He didn't need to. He touched the corner of it with a calloused thumb, a thumb with a dark, faint line under the nail where a hydraulic line had pinched it 7 years ago, and then he looked back at Devin. "We don't sign the release," Marcus said. "The gate agent's already calling." Devin whispered, checking his tablet. "It's the 5:15 a.m., non-stop to Dallas. Full house. 178 passengers. The regional manager's on his way down from the terminal because the turnaround time is already red flagged." "Let him come," Marcus said. "He doesn't fly the plane. He just sits in an office and looks at spreadsheets. We're the ones who put our names on the logbook." To understand how Marcus Webb came to be standing in an open hangar in the middle of a Louisiana winter, refusing to sign a release for a regional manager he had known for 10 years, you have to understand the specific arithmetic of a single father who worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, because it was the only shift that allowed him to make breakfast at 7:30 and be standing at the school gate at Sandent-Sherwoofen. His daughter, Zora, was 11 now. But she had been 3 when her mother, Adaez, died in a regional hospital, 3 counties over. It hadn't been a sudden thing. It had been 16 months of hospital rooms, of the specific, heavy smell of antiseptic and cold tea, of Marcus sitting in plastic chairs with a sleeping toddler across his lap while the IV pumps hummed their steady, indifferent rhythm in the dark. Ades had been a labor and delivery nurse. She had spent 11 years standing on her feet for 12 hours at a stretch, catching new lives as they came into the world. And she had told Marcus once, on a night when she was too tired to eat the dinner he'd saved for her, the best work I do is the work nobody ever thanks me for. If a baby comes out screaming and healthy and the mother doesn't even remember my name, that means everything went right. The only time they remember your name is when something goes wrong. When she died, Marcus took that sentence and built his whole life around it. He didn't want a promotion to shift supervisor. He didn't want a desk in the operations center where the air was conditioned and the coffee was hot. He wanted the ramp. He wanted the cold, greased, loud, dangerous reality of the aircraft, where 100,000 parts had to fit together with a tolerance measured in thousandths of an inch, and where his signature on a yellow maintenance tag was the only thin line between a routine flight and a headline on the evening news. He raised Zora alone. His mother, Geraldine, had lived with them for the first 4 years, teaching Marcus how to braid hair with hands that were used to holding 20-pound torque wrenches, showing him how to make jollof rice that tasted like home, and standing in the doorway at 10:30 every night to say, "Go on now. Those planes aren't going to fix themselves, and your daughter's going to be right here when you get back." Geraldine had passed away 3 years ago. Now it was just Marcus and Zora in a small, neat brick house 4 miles from the runway, where the sound of jet engines climbing out over the river was as familiar as the sound of the rain against the tin roof of the porch. Zora knew her father worked on airplanes. She knew he smelled like turbine oil and lava soap when he came home in the morning. What she didn't know what Marcus had spent 8 years making sure she would never have to know was the terrible, quiet weight of standing in a dark hangar at 3 in the morning, holding a part that had failed, and knowing that if he had been 5% less careful, 5% more tired, 5% more eager to go home, her world would have stopped turning. The hangar doors didn't open, but the side access door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic bang that echoed off the high rafters. Regina Voss walked across the concrete floor with the sharp, rhythmic click of 3-inch heels that had no business being on an active maintenance ramp. She was 42, the regional director of flight operations for the feeder carrier, and she wore an expensive wool coat draped over her shoulders like a cape, her hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead smooth. She didn't look at the engine. She didn't look at Devon. She looked directly at Marcus Webb, her hand already reaching into her leather bag for her tablet. "Marcus," she said. Her voice had the thin, high edge of a woman who had spent 12 hours dealing with weather delays in Atlanta and had zero interest in adding a mechanical cancellation to her morning report. "What is this?" The gate agent says, 472. Bravo is still offline. We have 178 passengers upstairs, 3 connecting crews, and a slot at Dallas that expires in 40 minutes. Why isn't this aircraft towed out? Left engine. Stage 3, compressor blade. Marcus said. He didn't stand up from his stool. He didn't wipe his hands, which were dark with grease around the knuckles. Microfracture at the root. We're pulling the assembly. Regina stopped 3 feet from the inspection table. She looked down at the blade, then at the tablet in her hand, then back at Marcus. Her lip curled, just slightly, at the sight of his boots, good leather. but worn flat at the heel, stained with hydraulic fluid that never fully washed out. A microfracture, she repeated. Her tone was smooth, instructional. The voice a person uses when they are trying to explain a simple concept to someone they believe is beneath them. Marcus. That engine had a full check in Denver 22 days ago. The logbook shows 0 anomalies. The vibration sensor on the flight in from Orlando showed a 0. 0.4 variance, well within the green band. Are you telling me that a Denver master technician missed a crack? But you found it with a hand lens at 3 in the morning? I'm telling you I found it. Marcus said, and the technician in Denver was looking at a digital log. I was looking at the metal. Marcus, she said, leaning forward slightly. Her perfume, something sharp and floral that smelled like a department store, display cutting through the heavy scent of Jet A, fuel and solvent. Let me be very clear with you. This airline loses $14,000 for every 30 minutes this aircraft sits on the ground. We have a corporate charter group upstairs that represents a $3 million account for our regional branch. The captain of this flight is an 18-year veteran who has already reviewed the Denver check and is satisfied with the airworthiness. She tapped her tablet screen with a manicured nail. You are a line mechanic. Marcus. You clean oil filters. You change tires. And you fill out the preliminary inspection sheets so the actual engineers can do their jobs. You are not a metallurgist. You do not have the authority to ground a multi-million-dollar asset because you think you saw a scratch on a blade that was certified 3 weeks ago. Devin took a half step back, his head down, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. Marcus didn't move. He looked at Regina Voss, at her immaculate coat, at her spotless leather gloves, at the small silver watch on her wrist that cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. He had seen 40 Regina Vosses in his 19 years. They came through every 3 or 4 years, promoted from some regional hub in the Midwest, carrying shiny degrees in logistics and an absolute, unshakable belief that the world was made of numbers on a screen rather than steel and fire in the sky. Ms. Voss, Marcus said, his voice flat and level as a carpenter's rule. You can take this aircraft off my maintenance hold whenever you want. All you have to do is take that stylus right there, open the master logbook, and sign your name under the override section. You sign that you personally inspected stage 3 of the left engine, that you found the blade airworthy, and that you assume full legal and civil liability for the airframe once the doors are closed. He picked up the stylus from the tray and held it out to her. Handle first. Go ahead, Marcus said softly. It takes 10 seconds. Regina looked at the stylus. Her hand stayed inside her pocket. Her jaw tightened until a small muscle twitched near her ear. You think you're being clever, she said, her voice dropping into a register that was no longer instructional, but cold and hard. You think because you've been sitting in this hangar for 20 years that you're indispensable. You're not, Marcus. You're a grease monkey with a union card and a high school diploma, sitting on a folding stool in the dark while real people try to run a business. I can have a certified inspector from Houston on a charter flight here by 7:00 a.m. And when he looks at that blade and tells me it's a non-structural surface mark, you won't just be off this shift. You'll be off the ramp. Permanently. Then call Houston, Marcus said. He turned his back on her, picked up his flashlight, and leaned back into the dark interior of the engine. Devin, get the 3/8 drive socket and the torque wrench. We're pulling the rest of the stage 3 blades so the inspector from Houston has something to look at when he gets here. Regina stood there for 3 seconds, her face dark, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. Then she turned on her heel, her 3-inch heels snapping against the floor like pistol shots. and disappeared through the side access door into the rain. The hangar went quiet again, except for the low, rhythmic hum of the air compressor in the corner and the steady drip of rainwater from the tail section overhang. Devon was staring at the door Regina had just walked through. His face was gray. Marcus. She's going to do it. She's going to call Houston. If they overrule you, you're done. You've got 6 years left until your full pension. Marcus didn't look up from the socket he was fitting onto the drive. You know what the hardest part of an engine to fix is, Devon? The turbine assembly? The man who works on it, Marcus said. A engine doesn't care about your pension. It doesn't care about a $3 million account. It doesn't care if you're black, white, rich, or sleeping on a cot in the break room. It only cares about physics. You respect the physics, or the physics will teach you a lesson that you don't get to live through twice. He set the socket against the first bolt of the retention ring. Click. Now give me the light, Marcus said. We've got 5 more aircraft on the roster before 7 o'clock, and none of them are going to inspect themselves. What followed over the next 3 hours was the kind of work that never shows up in an airline's promotional videos. It was not dramatic. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, no screaming passengers. It was just 2 men in dark blue coveralls, moving from one cold aluminum hull to another across 6 acres of wet, oil-stained concrete, carrying 30 pounds of tools and a pair of flashlights that had seen 1,000 nights just like this one. On the second aircraft, a Boeing 737 that had come in from Atlanta with a minor landing gear advisory, Marcus found a hydraulic line fitting on the nose wheel assembly that had been torqued 60 inch-pounds over spec by a night shift crew in Charlotte. It wasn't leaking yet. It would have held for 20 landings, maybe 30. But on the 31st landing, in a crosswind at New Orleans with 200 people on board, the fitting would have cracked. The pressure would have dropped to 0. And the pilot would have found out what it means to steer a 100,000-pound airplane with one brake and no nose wheel steering. Marcus didn't write a long report. He backed the fitting off, replaced the crushed O-ring with a fresh one from his kit, torqued it to 75 inch-pounds with a calibrated wrench, and marked it with a small dab of yellow torque seal paint. On the third aircraft, an Airbus A320 sitting on the remote cargo pad, the issue wasn't metal at all. It was water. A fuel sump test on the right wing tank yielded a clear glass jar that looked fine at first glance. But when Marcus held his penlight behind the glass and tilted it 3 degrees to the left, a faint, cloudy swirl appeared near the bottom, the specific, milky signature of water that had been emulsified by a failing fuel heater filter during high-altitude transit. If that gets to the injectors at 35,000 feet, Marcus told Devon, showing him the jar. It freezes. The water ice clogs the fine mesh screens in the fuel control unit. The engine starves. Not because there's no fuel in the tank, but because the fuel can't get through the ice. They drained 3 gallons from the sump, purged the lines, replaced the heater element, and ran a fresh test until the glass jar showed nothing but clear. Amber Jeddah, sparkling like honey under the flashlight beam. B445 AM. Marcus's knees were aching with the dull, deep throb that always came when the humidity in the river air rose above 90%. His back was stiff from leaning into wheel wells and crawling under belly panels. And his left index finger had a fresh, stinging cut from a safety wire he'd clipped too close on a generator, housing. He sat on an upside-down plastic crate behind the 4th aircraft, a small Embraer 145 regional jet, and pulled his thermos out of his tool bag. The coffee was black, bitter, and lukewarm. But it was hot enough to take the chill out of his throat. Devin sat on the edge of a tug tire across from him, his hands tucked into his armpits for warmth. He looked at Marcus for a long time before he spoke. "Marcus?" "Yeah." "Why do you stay on the ramp?" Devin asked. "I talked to the guys in avionics. They said you passed the Master Systems exam 6 years ago. They said you could have been an inspector for the FAA. You could be making $80,000 a year sitting in a warm office in Oklahoma City, checking certified logs on a computer." Marcus drank his coffee. He looked out through the open hangar doors toward the runway, where the high-intensity edge lights were glowing like yellow beads through the river fog. "When I was 12 years old," Marcus said slowly, "my uncle worked on the freight docks down in Plaquemines Parish. He was a big man, 6'4", hands like shovel blades. He worked 40 years loading banana boats and grain barges. One day, a crane cable snapped on a grain elevator. A 16-inch steel beam came down right across his legs." Marcus set the thermos lid down on his knee. "The company sent an insurance adjuster down from New Orleans 3 days later." Marcus continued. "A man in a linen suit with a gold pocket watch. He sat in my uncle's front room, looked at my aunt, and offered her $1,200 to sign a release saying the company wasn't responsible for the cable maintenance. He told her my uncle was just a laborer, that cables wear out, and that nobody could have known the steel was rusting from the inside." Devin was quiet. "My aunt didn't take the money," Marcus said. "She took a piece of that snapped cable my uncle had saved, a 6-inch section of it in a bucket, and she walked it up to the engineering school at Tulane. She found a professor there who looked at the rust pattern under a microscope and told her that cable had been failing for 6 months. It had been reported twice by the dock crew. But the manager had written "inspected clear" on the log to keep the grain moving." Marcus looked down at his hands at the dark grease, the scar across his thumb, the short, clean nails. "That adjuster in the linen suit," Marcus said, "he didn't kill my uncle. The rust killed my uncle. But the man who wrote 'clear' on a logbook he hadn't actually checked, he's the one who made sure my uncle didn't walk again. I decided that night that if I ever worked on anything that carried human beings, nobody would ever have to wonder if I was telling the truth when I put my name on a piece of paper." He stood up, his knees cracking in the cold air, and picked up his tool bag. "Let's go check Fem 104, Delta," Marcus said. "The charter crew's coming in at 5, and I want that belly panel torqued before they get here." The 6th aircraft was the Charter, a Gulfstream 4 owned by a private aviation firm that leased planes to corporate executives, high-end travel groups, and, occasionally, government agencies. It was sitting on the private ramp near the fixed base operator terminal, away from the commercial gates. The plane was sleek, white, with a dark blue stripe running down the fuselage and gold-plated trim around the cabin door. Marcus and Devin walked up the mobile stairs just as the FBO manager, a young man in an immaculate Navy suit, was coming down with a clipboard. "You the line crew for the pre-flight?" the manager asked, checking his watch. "Captain's already on board. They're running 30 minutes behind schedule." The charter group just arrived at the private terminal in 3 black SUVs. "We're doing the exterior walk-around and the engine inlet checks," Marcus said. "Make it quick," the manager said. "The client on this flight is some heavy hitter from the Regional Transport Authority. She's been on the phone with corporate for 2 hours about a commercial cancellation over at Gate 12. She's in a mood that could strip paint." Marcus stopped at the top of the stairs. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Devin, who had also stopped, his eyes wide as he made the connection. "Marcus," Devin whispered. "Get the light," Marcus said calmly. "We checked the plane." They walked into the cabin first to check the emergency exit latches and the overhead pressure seals. The Gulfstream was a flying palace cream-colored leather seats, thick wool carpet that swallowed the sound of their boots, polished mahogany tables, and a galley stocked with crystal glasses and fresh orchids in silver vases. Standing near the forward galley, with a phone pressed to her ear and her wool coat draped over the back of seat 2A, was Regina Voss. Her back was to them, her voice carrying clearly through the small, quiet cabin. "I don't care what the union rules say, Arthur," she was saying into the phone, her tone furious and sharp. "I want that mechanic cited for insubordination. He held 178 passengers on the ground for 4 hours over a scratch on a compressor blade that Denver certified 3 weeks ago. I had to pull $3,000 out of my contingency budget to charter this Gulfstream just to get our VIP group to the Dallas summit before the 9 a.m. opening remarks." She turned around as she spoke, her eyes sweeping over the cabin and froze. Marcus was standing 3 feet away, holding an inspection flashlight in his right hand and his tool bag in his left. His coveralls were dark at the knees from the wet ramp. His face was calm, unhurried, his brown eyes fixed on her with the absolute, steady presence of a man who belonged exactly where he was standing. Regina lowered the phone slowly from her ear. "You?" she said. "Ms. Voss," Marcus said. He gave her a short, professional nod. "We're doing the pre-flight inspection on this airframe before your departure. I am the client on this charter." "Marcus," she said, her voice rising an octave, the frustration of the last 4 hours breaking through her carefully constructed corporate composure. "I paid $7,000 out of my regional operating budget to get away from your hangar so I wouldn't miss a meeting that affects the entire Southern logistics network. Are you telling me you're inspecting this plane? 2? I inspect every plane that leaves this ramp between 11 at night and 7 in the morning," Marcus said. "That's what the airline pays me for." "This isn't the airline's plane," she said, her hand gesturing wildly toward the mahogany trim and the leather seats. "This is an independent charter! They have their own maintenance staff in Houston!" "Their staff is in Houston," Marcus said. "This plane is in New Orleans. And until it clears 40,000 feet over the state line, it's on my ramp." He turned to Devon. "Devon, check the main door pressure seal. I'm going to take a look at the tail cone hydraulic actuator." Regina stood in the middle of the aisle, her phone still clutched in her hand, her face dark with an outrage that had gone past speech. "If you delay this flight," she whispered through her teeth, "I will make it my personal mission to see that you never touch another aircraft in this state." Marcus didn't answer. He walked past her, his heavy boots making no sound on the thick wool carpet, and disappeared into the aft compartment where the flight controls connected to the tail assembly. The tail cone of a Gulfstream 4 is a narrow, cramped space accessible through a small hatch in the rear baggage compartment. It smells of insulation, hydraulic oil, and the cold, metallic tang of sealed aluminum. Marcus crawled in on his belly, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark toward the primary flight control actuators, the hydraulic rams that move the elevators and the rudder, the surfaces that keep the airplane from pitching into the ground or rolling out of control in high-speed flight. He checked the primary ram, clear, dry, torque marks intact. He checked the secondary ram, clear, dry. He checked the emergency manual trim cable, the braided steel wire that allows a pilot to control the tail manually if the main hydraulic system fails completely. The cable ran through a small brass fairlead mounted against the frame. Marcus brought his light closer. The wire wasn't broken. It wasn't even frayed on the outside. But where the braided cable passed through the brass guide, 3 small strands of the inner core had unraveled, forming a tiny, sharp bird nest of wire that was wedged inside the fair lead mechanism. If the main hydraulic system worked fine, the pilot would never touch that cable. The plane would fly, land, and take off again 100 times without an issue. But if the plane encountered severe turbulence, the kind of sudden, heavy mountain wave turbulence that hits regional jets over East Texas every winter, and the pilot had to switch to manual trim to stabilize the tail, the wire would pull into the guide. The bird nest of frayed steel would jam in the brass fair lead, and the manual trim would lock solid in whatever position it was in at that exact second. If it locked in a dive position, no amount of force on the control yoke could pull the nose back up. Marcus laid his forehead against the cold aluminum frame for 3 seconds. He closed his eyes. In the quiet of the tail cone, he could hear the sound of the rain outside, hitting the skin of the aircraft with a soft, steady times pat, pat, pat. He could hear the low murmur of Regina Voss's voice in the forward cabin, still talking on her phone, still calculating the cost of 30 minutes, still worrying about opening remarks at a conference in Dallas. He thought about Zora. He thought about her sitting at the kitchen table 3 hours from now, eating the oatmeal he'd make for her, showing him a drawing she'd finished for her science project. He thought about the adjuster in the linen suit who had sat in his aunt's front room 40 years ago and told her that cables just wear out, and that nobody could have known. Marcus opened his eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his yellow maintenance tag, and clipped it directly over the tail cone access hatch latch. Then he crawled back out. Regina was sitting in seat 2A, a cup of coffee in her hand, her coat already buttoned. When Marcus stepped out of the baggage compartment, her eyes followed him with a cold, triumphant challenge. "Well, is your theatrical inspection finished so we can close the door?" Marcus didn't look at her. He walked past her to the forward entry, where the charter captain, a man in his late 50s with graying temples and a clean 3-striped jacket, was standing near the galley, checking his iPad. "Captain," Marcus said. The captain looked up. "Yeah, Chief. We good to go? The client's getting restless." "Aircraft is grounded," Marcus said. His voice was steady, quiet, carried through the small cabin like a bell ringing in a quiet church. "Primary manual trim control cable is compromised in the aft bay. Fair lead jam hazard. I've red-tagged the airframe." The captain's face changed instantly. The casual, professional detachment vanished, replaced by the sharp, immediate focus of a man who had 20,000 hours in the air and knew exactly what a jammed trim cable meant at cruise speed. "Compromised how?" the captain asked, stepping toward Marcus. "Core strand separation at the frame 14 guide." Marcus said, "It's wedged inside the sleeve. You pull manual nose-up trim more than 2 degrees, and it's going to lock on you." Regina stood up so fast, her coffee spilled across the mahogany table, dark liquid pooling against the cream leather of the armrest. "This is absurd!" she screamed, her voice finally breaking out of its corporate control into pure, unadulterated fury. "He's doing this on purpose, Captain. This man had an argument with me 4 hours ago in the main hangar. He's using your airframe to settle a personal grievance because I threatened his job." She marched down the narrow aisle, her finger pointed directly at Marcus's chest, stopping 2 inches from his blue coveralls. "Look at him!" she shouted, turning to the captain. "He's a line mechanic. He's been working the graveyard shift on a regional ramp for 20 years. He found a mark on an engine this morning that my Denver team missed. And now he's claiming a cable is jammed on a $7 million Gulfstream that was serviced in Savannah 4 days ago. He is sabotaging my schedule. The captain didn't look at Regina. He looked at Marcus. You got a scope picture of the cable? The captain asked quietly. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulled out his tablet, and tapped the screen. He handed it to the captain. The image was crystal clear, high definition, macro-focused. The bright beam of Marcus's penlight illuminating the tiny, frayed nest of steel wire, wedged tight inside the yellow brass fair lead. The captain looked at the image for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. He didn't yell. He didn't look at Regina. He reached up, took his cap off his head, and laid it carefully on the galley counter. Flights canceled. The captain said to the cabin. Regina stared at him, her mouth open. What? Flights canceled. Ms. Voss. The captain repeated, his voice completely flat, completely immovable. If that cable jams in a high-speed descent, we don't have an airplane anymore. We have a lawnmower, heading south at 5 to 100 knots. He turned to Marcus, looked at the dark grease on his knuckles, at the yellow tag clipped to his tool bag, and then extended his hand. Good catch. Chief, the captain said, I've been flying this bird for 6 years. I didn't even know that guide was showing where. Marcus took the captain's hand. Their palms met the clean, soft hand of the pilot and the rough, oil-stained hand of the mechanic, and held for 2 seconds. It's what we do, Marcus said simply. Regina stood in the middle of the aisle. The rain was hitting the windshield of the cockpit now, hard and steady, the sound filling the silence of the cabin. She looked at the captain, who was already on his iPad canceling their flight plan. She looked at the tablet screen on the counter, where the image of the frayed wire was still glowing in high definition. Then she looked at Marcus. Really looked at him. Not at his worn boots, not at his blue coveralls, not at his union card. She looked at his face, at the calm, dark eyes that had looked into 6 engines tonight, at the quiet, unyielding posture of a man who had stood his ground against 4 hours of threats, 4 hours of authority, 4 hours of money, and hadn't moved an inch. Her hand came out of her pocket. She reached for the wool coat draped over the seat, her movement slow, heavy, like a woman who had suddenly grown very tired. Marcus, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It didn't carry the high, sharp edge anymore. It was just small. How? How did you see that? It's inside the frame. Marcus picked up his tool bag from the floor. He checked the zipper, adjusted the strap over his shoulder, and looked at her. My aunt had a piece of cable, Marcus said softly. It sat on our mantelpiece for 20 years. When you look at something long enough, you learn what it looks like right before it breaks. He turned and walked down the mobile stairs into the gray, early light of the morning. The sun was just beginning to break through the low river fog at 7:05 a.m. when Marcus Webb walked out of the maintenance locker room. He had showered, but the faint scent of turbine oil still lingered behind his ears. And his hands, though scrubbed clean with lava soap, still carried the dark, indelible lines of 19 years of ramp work in the creases of his palms. Devon was waiting for him near the exit gate, holding 2 paper cups of hot coffee from the FBO lounge. Houston inspector came in on the 6:30 shuttle, Devon said, handing Marcus a cup. He looked at the Stage 3 blade from 472 Bravo. Marcus took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, strong, and tasted like fresh beans. And he signed the scrap tag. Devon said, a small, proud grin breaking across his young face. Said the crack went 40% through the root. Said if that engine had run another 2 hours at full thrust, the blade would have separated completely. Marcus looked out across the tarmac. The 5:15 a.m. nonstop to Dallas, the one that had been delayed 4 hours while they swapped the blade, was currently rolling down runway 11. Right. Its twin engines roaring with a deep, steady, perfect thunder as it lifted into the blue morning sky above the river. 178 passengers, 3 connecting crews, moving safely toward Texas at 400 miles an hour, completely unaware that their lives had been saved by an 11-minute inspection in the dark. "Where's Ms. Voss?" Marcus asked. "She's in the FBO office." Devon said, "She missed her conference opening in Dallas. Her boss called her from Atlanta 20 minutes ago." Devon hesitated, looking at Marcus. She left something for you at the front desk." Devon added, "The manager asked me to give it to you." Devon reached into his pocket and pulled out a standard airline maintenance logbook sheet. Across the bottom, in the section reserved for corporate authorization and operational overrides, Regina Voss had written 3 lines in neat, dark blue ink. Inspectors Webb and Atkins performed exemplary preventative maintenance on airframes 472B and 502D. Their refusal to compromise safety standards under operational pressure saved this carrier from 2 catastrophic in-flight failures. Recommend both technicians for the National Transportation Safety Commendation. Below the lines was her full signature, bold and clear, beside her corporate title. Marcus looked at the paper for 5 seconds. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. He folded the sheet neatly in half, then in half again, and slipped it into his front pocket right next to the small, laminated caliper and the crayon drawing of the blue airplane. "Come on, Devon," Marcus said, putting his cap on his head. "Shift's over." At 2:55 a.m., Marcus Webb pulled his old Ford pickup into the driveway of the small brick house 4 miles from the runway. The rain had stopped. The morning sun was bright and clear, reflecting off the wet tin roof of the porch and the green grass of the front yard. He walked up the front steps, unlocked the door, and stepped into the warm, quiet hallway that smelled of cinnamon, toasted bread, and the clean, familiar scent of home. Zora was sitting at the kitchen table, a bowl of oatmeal in front of her. Her school binder open to a page covered in long division problems. She was wearing her yellow rain boots and a sweater that was 2 sizes too big for her, her dark braids tied back with red ribbons. She looked up as the back door opened, her eyes lighting up with the sudden, complete joy that only an 11-year-old child can give to a parent coming home from the dark. "Dad!" she called out, jumping up from her chair. Marcus dropped his tool bag by the door, knelt on the linoleum floor, and opened his arms wide. She hit his chest like a small cannonball, her arms wrapping tight around his neck, her face buried in the soft collar of his flannel shirt. "Did you fix the planes?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Marcus held her close, feeling the steady, warm rhythm of her breathing, the heartbeat against his ribs, the absolute and perfect reality of the world he had spent 12 hours protecting. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded logbook sheet, and laid it on the table beside her school binder, right next to her crayons. "Yeah, baby," Marcus whispered, pressing a kiss into her dark hair. "We fixed the planes." This story is fiction. Marcus Webb, Zora, Regina Voss, and Devon Atkins are characters created to hold a truth that is not fictional at all. Every single day, millions of human beings step onto aluminum tubes sealed with pressurized air and fly 7 miles above the Earth at 500 miles an hour. They drink their coffee. They watch their movies. They sleep against the windows, completely convinced that the world is a safe and predictable place. They rarely think about the men and women in dark blue coveralls who stand in open hangars at 3 in the morning, carrying flashlights and torque wrenches through the cold and the rain. They don't know their names. They don't see their faces. They don't know about the microfractures caught on a compressor blade, the water drained from a fuel line, the frayed wire found inside an aluminum frame 4 minutes before takeoff. The world works because there are people who care more about physics than they do about spreadsheets. People who believe that a signature on a logbook actually means something. People who understand that the highest form of work is the work that leaves no trace behind it except a routine landing on a dry runway in the morning sun. The next time you're sitting on a plane, waiting out an unexplained maintenance delay, while the clock ticks down and the gate agent makes another vague announcement over the speaker, don't be angry at the delay. Take a second to think about the man with the dark grease under his fingernails, standing in the cold beneath your wing, making sure that the plane you're sitting on is the plane that brings you home to the people who are waiting for you at the gate. He's not delaying your life. He's making sure you get to keep it. If this story reached you, leave a comment down below about a person whose invisible, quiet work keeps your world running: a mechanic, a caregiver, a line worker, a late-night cleaner, whose name nobody knows, but whose thoroughness makes everything else possible. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that real value isn't measured by the title on a business card, but by the quiet, unyielding integrity of the hands that do the work. And subscribe to Black Stories for more tales about the men and women who stand their ground when the rest of the world is trying to hurry past. Keep your eyes on the metal, respect the physics, and never sign your name to something you haven't checked with your own hands.